Start again. Welcome everybody to this first webinar being run by the Lancashire Forum of Faiths in collaboration with the Lancashire County Council. It's arisen out of the circumstances of the COVID-19 pandemic, when through the Lancashire Resilience Forum there was a concern and focus on the issue of death and how to deal with the anticipated large number of deaths that might have been expected. So that led to some interesting conversations and practicalities around dealing with death and bodies, etc. Those of us who are on the Resilience Forum, the faith group, thought that this sort of opened the way for a deeper exploration and conversations around not just death itself, but leading up to death, how people comforted in the dying process, how are relatives comforted, and what about after death? What are beliefs in different faith traditions? So it seemed a good opportunity to explore what we might learn from each other. What good might come out of suffering and grief, which I think is a fairly universal idea in faith traditions, that out of grief and suffering, good things can come. So we've got 7 representatives from 7 faiths. I've got from the Jewish faith, we've got Amy Troner. Do you want to wave your hand, Amy? From the Buddhist tradition, we've got Neil Proctor. From the Sikhs, we have Hardeep Singh. Christianity, we've got Canon Rowena Paling. Hindu, Charu Ainscough. Baha'i, Marion Pollitt. And Muslims, Afrasiab Anwar. Where's Afrasiab? Oh, there he is, yeah. So going to ask each of them to speak for about 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes in turn. First of all, around that question of dying and comfort for those dying, for families. How is prayer used? And for those of you who are watching this, or for any of the other panelists, if you've got questions or comments or observations, if you could use the chat function, then when each of the 7 people has spoken, we'll then have 5 minutes or so to share some of those thoughts or address some of those questions. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to ask Amy to lead things off from a Jewish perspective. If you want to unmute yourself, Amy, and the floor is yours.
Okay, lovely, thank you. So to begin with, I better state that there are several branches of Judaism. So in England, the main division is Orthodox, Reform, and Liberal. And it's important to know that these all have different interpretations and views on lots of issues, different observances. So the way that I'm coming about it is I was raised a conservative Jew in America, which is most similar to Reform in the UK. So Jews will do just the same as everybody else as far as, looking after dying and comforting people. The thing that I thought I would focus on is a prayer that's called Misha Beirach, which is something that we would say when people are ill, recovering from an accident. And you would say it as a congregation in synagogue. This particular prayer, it asks for physical and spiritual healing. It asks for blessing, restoration. It asks for strength. It's for Jews and for non-Jews. And it's quite interesting because it's a very communal prayer. So it's unusual from other ones where you would, you can either approach the rabbi or whoever is leading the service, and you would tell him the name of the person who is ill or not well just before the service. And then he will say this out loud and put it in during the prayer. So it could sometimes go 20 to 40 names within a community that are being read out during a service. And in some congregations, the people will actually stand up during the prayer and say the name of that loved one. It will often be in Hebrew, the person's name, but it doesn't have to be. And I think the thing that's very important about it, it's not only to say the prayer, but it allows the community to know who's suffering, who needs support right now, you know, who is it that has a loved one that's ill or not well. And this prayer can be said, you can visit somebody in the hospital, you know, it's a prayer that can be said everywhere, but it's our most communal prayer. And just finish by saying that in Judaism, when a person passes away, it's actually a sacred obligation of every Jew to comfort a mourner. So this is whether you're related to them or not, and I'll talk about that in the next section, but it's a good deed to comfort a mourner. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Lovely. Okay, following on, Neil, can you talk for less than 2 minutes from a Buddhist perspective?
Sorry.
Me talking less than 2 minutes. Yes, my Buddhism is Nichiren Buddhism, and I'm a member of the Soka Gakkai International, which is a Japanese Buddhism. And like Judaism, there's lots and lots of different branches within Buddhism, and they tend to differ very, very differently from sect to sect. We don't really have any rituals around people dying. What we do, we chant a phrase over and over again. We're chanters, not meditators. So we'll recite. It's seen as being good for the person who's dying to hear the phrase as they leave this existence. And what we tend to do around death, the phrase that comes up a lot is we chant for that person's eternal happiness. And a phrase comes up a lot as well, a beautiful death. So yeah, that's pretty much in a nutshell our approach to the process of dying.
Thanks for that, Neil. That's, I like that we're chanters, not meditators.
Yeah, well, we see one as, and this is maybe an arrogant thing, but we see one as passive and one as assertive. And obviously we look at the chanting as the more assertive of the two. But that can be seen as arrogant to people who do meditate. So
no, not at all. Okay, that's great. Thanks, Neil, for that, and for amazingly good timekeeping. Hardy, can you talk to us from a Sikh perspective?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? No.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? All right, okay. Right. Sat Sri Akal to all of you, first of all. In Sikh religion, its scripture, Guru Granth Sahib, is the way of life and gives very clear guidance in all aspects of life, including the dying, death, and life after death. According to Sikhism, journey of death begins as soon as one is born. So death not only becomes part of our lives, but gives us a realization of the fact that after taking one breath, we are closer to death. If we live our lives virtuously, according to the teachings of the Holy Scripture, this journey becomes less fearful, less painful, and more comfortable and accepting to God's will. We take strength from our teachings, and we go and we carry on. When one is at the end of his or her death, end of life, there are a lot of things we can do to support the person by just being with them and accepting the wishes. Religiously and spiritually, there are a number of prayers we can offer, chapters and compositions we can choose, select and recite next to the person. We believe removes the fear of death and gives the person who is dying comfort and peaceful onward journey. And those left behind the feeling of bliss, peace, and acceptance. There are a number of prayers we can do at these times, special prayers written in Guru Granth Sahib. First one is Dukhbandhani Sahib, which means if it's like that, we believe that relieves pain. And second one is Sukhmani Sahib, which means if we recite that to the person, that gives comfort and peace. Third one is Chaupai Sahib, which we ask God to take care of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Hardeep. Thank you for that. Moving on, Rowena, Canon Rowena Paling, from a Christian perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. And as has been said for other faiths, Christianity also has a number of different strands. So I'm from the Church of England, but we'll try and give a sort of broad brush approach. First of all, I wonder whether the coronavirus pandemic has actually made death less of a taboo, not just in Christian culture, but in secular society more generally. Death is something which many people feel uncomfortable speaking about, but the reality of it, terrible though that is, does do something to make us be more open, which I think is a good thing. For those who take Christian funerals, who are mainly clergy, but also licensed lay people, death is a huge part of our ministry, both within the faith community and also in the Church of England. For people outside the faith community, a lot of the funerals that we take are for people who are not necessarily practicing Christians, but would nominally define themselves as Christians and ask for a church funeral. Those who take the funerals are specially trained in bereavement. Will obviously signpost to specialists when the need arises, but will also advise on things like how to talk about death with children, secular techniques such as memory boxes, books that people might read to help themselves through the grieving process. In terms of the faith community, I guess the process includes ongoing prayer and visits to both to the dying person and also to their family. Depending on the particular strand of Christianity, there may be specific prayers at the time of death. There may be anointing with holy oil. And for some people receiving communion, that is the blessed bread and wine before death or shortly before death is really important. Just to cheat slightly and go a little beyond death to before the funeral, in some cultures, the time between death and funeral is also really important, a time for families and communities to gather together, and the body of the deceased person may be brought into church the night before the funeral, and local churches will continue remembering them in their local prayers. But I guess as a faith community, one of the things that we find with death and bereavement is that those who are bereaved often seem to feel that death then enables them to ask other big questions about God. So it's often a way into faith as well as something for the faith community itself.
Thanks, Rowena. That's a really interesting observation there. Yeah, that's great. Charu, from a Hindu perspective, please, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Like other people have said, Hinduism does have various strands to it, and I'm obviously from that belief system which is called the Sanatan Dharma. Not being learned in the religion or the philosophy, I will explain to you what I have learned through my life experience and some of my observations and inquiry. And there are certain beliefs and practices within the faith which I do not support. Things like the caste system and other aspects of Hindu religion, where we have a book that really puts the position of women totally down, but that's long been forgotten by some but resurrected by others. Generally speaking, Hinduism is believed to be both a monotheistic, Hinduism is both a monotheistic and polytheistic religion, and people confuse this religion because they think, what is all these different gods for? But there is only one God, and we believe God has many forms. And the other interesting fact to share, which I'm sure other religions also have beliefs around, is that for the Hindus, God is represented in the notion of the Trinity, which is creation, preservation, and destruction. In Indian words, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. And this is basically the forces of nature, which is the foundation of the universe, which we call Brahman. Now, in terms of leading up to the death, there is a realization that death is a very normal aspect of life and death. And following on from somebody's death, that the soul leaves that body, that shell, and moves on, transmigrates, and we believe in the notion of reincarnation. And the soul has many, many, many lives. So it depends on the way that you have led your life, the kind of deeds, good deeds, and the kind of behaviors that you have shown that allows you to achieve gradually that notion of leaving this life of birth and death and birth and death, so that you go and live with that Brahman, which is the foundation of the universe, which is basically energy source. And at the death, if we know that people are dying, then we administer the holy waters, which is called Ganga Jal, from the river, the Ganges. And also we use a plant, we put a leaf in their mouths, which is a basil plant. And then as soon as after they're dead, we try and ensure that they come to Mother Earth and nature. Prayers and hymns are chanted whilst they're in hospital or they're at home. Thank you.
Again, thanks very much, Charu. That's very comprehensive. Marion, I think some people are probably unfamiliar with the Baha'i religion, and good to know that there's a Baha'i community in Lancashire, and I know some others are in the audience here. So just in your minute and a half to 2 minutes, Marion, dying from a Baha'i perspective.
Thank you. When the Baha'i is in the final stages of his or her life, the family and the friends, the Baha'i community, make every effort to support the family, the person, by visiting as often as possible, as often as the person would like, by praying with them, reading or chanting prayers, reading from the writings, and also in our meetings privately afterwards, the Baha'i community would pray, and when we come home, to remember that person in their grief. There are no specific prayers at this time that are chanted or sung or read, but perhaps one might read some healing prayers for the family who are certainly suffering. Baha'is believe that in an eternal life beyond this earthly place of existence is the very purpose of what we are created for, to prepare ourselves for the future life in the spiritual dimension. And we recognize God, develop our spiritual qualities. That is our purpose. And so it wouldn't be unusual to talk about dying and death and to talk about this aspect of our faith with somebody who's very poorly, because it's what we all believe is our very purpose. So we would share maybe readings about the spiritual realm with the individual and the family. I was asked to mention in one message from Peter about wills and things like that. I don't know if this is the space, but all Baha'is are enjoined to make a will. So there is no worry about that at the time. And the main thing is to give support for the family through prayer, readings and comfort.
Smashing. Thank you very much, Marion. That's great. And last on this section of our webinar, Afrasiab from the Muslim basic Muslim perspective.
Thank you, Peter. I think having listened to other speakers, I think there's a lot of similarities with other faiths, but particularly with some of the things that Amy said around similarities with Judaism and Christianity in terms of the different branches. But when somebody falls sick, or when somebody is obviously passes away, in Islam, it's very much a communal, very much a community affair, where the whole community, like Marion just said, is that pulls together and supports one another. So one of the things that we get in our communities is that if somebody falls ill, for instance, in the community. In the mosque, there might be special prayers for them. The imam might make an announcement to say so-and-so is ill, and we're encouraged to visit one another as well. And that sort of shows that, you know, empathy and love and unity and compassion for one another. And there's also a hadith narration which says that the Prophet Muhammad said that on the day of resurrection, God will ask the child of Adam and say, I became sick and you didn't visit me. And the person will respond, oh Lord, how can I visit you when you are the Lord of everything that exists? And God will say, that my slave so-and-so was ill, was sick, and you did not visit him. Did you not know that if you visited him, you would have found me with him? And that sort of, you know, shows that the rights of Muslims upon one another. And there's another narration that says that the rights of Muslims upon one another, there are 6 of them. So the first one is that when you meet them, you greet them with salam, which means peace. When invited, you respond to that invitation. When asked to give advice, you give sincere advice. And then when someone sneezes, you praise God. And in return, you ask for God to make them well. And then when somebody passes away, the right that someone has over you is that you join and accompany that funeral procession. So that's one of the rights that we have on one another. And so that's why you'll find that in the community, when somebody does pass away, that if there is a funeral, many of us will, do the most we can to ensure that we take part in that funeral procession, because it's one of the rights that we have over one another.
Thanks, Afrasiab, and thanks everybody for your succinct summaries there. Just got this. It might just be one question, I think, for this part, and you don't all have to answer. In fact, probably best if we don't all try and answer it. But Dave Carr from LCC, has asked about death as a result of the COVID pandemic. Has death become normalized, and do different faiths try and avoid death, or is death something to be feared, or is it something to be accepted? Dave, do you want to just articulate that a little bit better than I have?
Yeah, I suppose what was going through my head was some of the conversations that you might have and things that you read in the media about an acceptance that a certain number of COVID deaths are inevitable, and accepting it's always almost become normalised, and we've had tens of thousands of people die, but actually it feels to some people quite normal that has happened. So I suppose my question was really in terms of faiths and caring about the human form of life, whether all faiths think that we should do everything that we can as a society to avoid death.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Or is death something that's a more natural thing to be accepted? Yeah. So avoiding
should we
death.
be accepting the number of deaths, I suppose, that we've had?
Yeah, although I suppose there's a slight difference between the COVID deaths as a quite specific situation compared with.
It was an example, I suppose.
Yeah.
I think, Peter, if I can come in, I think just on that, I think although I think might speak for other faiths on this as well, but I think although that life and death is a part of that cycle, which all of us, which is natural, which we are all accustomed to, but and which our traditions teach. But our religion, from an Islamic perspective, also teaches us the sanctity of life as well, and so that we've got to do everything to ensure and protect and save life. So that's important as well. So it's important that we do that, so we don't just say, right, okay, there's from a COVID or pandemic point of view, that this is happening and that's it. It's to be accepted. We've got to put in all the measures to ensure that we save life as well, and so that's important that we do that. So
right. Yeah. I mean, anybody's welcome to. In fact, Dave's posted that question on the chat function. So if those who are watching, not on the panel, if you've got a view on that or a a thought, please do put that in on the chat, because that's a good way of sharing it. Does anybody else from the panel want to respond to Dave's question? Amy? Unmute Amy, and then off you go. Thank you.
I always love these because we all say, and similar to that faith, and similar to Islam, obviously life is always the priority. And I'll just make it clear that, you know, when you have the Sabbath, we have very, very certain restrictions that you have to do. If a person's life is at stake, that will always come first. You know, if you have to break the laws of Sabbath, a life is always first. And it's the same with this. You don't accept that death is just a part of life. You certainly take precautions. So again, life is the priority, just similar to Islam. And I'm sure everyone, but just because Faziab mentioned that. That's it.
Neil, yeah?
Very briefly, Buddhism came about specifically to answer the eternal questions of birth, sickness, aging, and death. So we have a little bit of a different approach. We obviously value life, but death is our ultimate destination. And it's a question that we talk about a lot, is how do we prepare ourselves, even at my tender age, for death, really. So obviously we don't, COVID aside, we embrace it, really.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else from the panel want to say anything? Don't have to. We've got plenty more to cover. But I think that's an interesting one for further exploration at some point, almost the tension between preservation of life and acceptance of death. And, you know, I think, you know, at what point is a life still a life? You know, we've got such advances in medical science that we can keep people alive, but is there still quality of life? And that might be an interesting one to explore further. But if we could move on at this point to our next section, which is around death itself and how we deal with you know, with the person who has died, whether we cremate, whether we bury, the reasons for that, the nature of funeral services. And I'm going to ask Hardeep to start us on this one from a Sikh perspective. So you need to unmute, Hardeep.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
There's a lot of interference in the sound.
There's a lot of interference, Hardeep. I don't know why.
I dialed in.
Oh, right. If you've dialed in, you probably need to hang up on one of your connections. You'll need to shut down your computer and just use the dial-in.
Oh.
I tell you what, while you're doing that, Hardeep, while you're doing that, I'll move on, and I'm going to ask Rowena Paling to speak. So if you can be closing down your computer, Hardeep, we'll come back to you on the telephone. All right?
Okay, thank you.
Rowena.
Okay, so in Christianity, funerals and rituals around funerals vary a lot depending on culture and tradition. It's really important to remember that Christianity isn't just white British. And so, for example, for Christians of African or South Asian or Caribbean heritage, it can often be really important to have an open coffin at the funeral, and that they would tend to go for burial rather than for cremation. But for any Christian funeral, there are essentially two parts. The first part is the funeral itself, where particular readings from the Bible will be given, prayers will be said, there'll be a remembrance of the person's life. And then there's the act of burial or cremation, where the person is then entrusted to God. The majority of Christian funerals will have the coffin present in the funeral part, though in some traditions they do it the other way around. So they actually have the burial or cremation first, and then afterwards more of a memorial service. And that's especially more evangelical Christian traditions. The majority of Christian funerals in this country are cremations. And obviously we work very closely with funeral directors, but a lot of the kind of extra bits really are cultural. So for example, funerals, there's no religious flowers. There's no religious reason to have flowers at a funeral. That's something which is cultural. The tone of the funeral often really depends on the family and again on their cultural background. I think there are probably 5 themes that we'd have, and I'll just kind of whip through this really quickly. One theme might be resurrection hope. Christians believe in life after death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So resurrection hope is one. Another theme might be death as eternal rest, an eternal Sabbath day that kind of goes on forever, or peace following suffering, perhaps in an illness. A third theme might be making sense of confusion or grief. A fourth theme might be around thanksgiving, how a life lived demonstrates the love of God to other people, that their life is more than just its ending. And the fifth theme might be about God's creative power, celebrating the love that God has for all people and the lives that he has created. The most challenging funerals tend to be those where it's been a sudden death or death by suicide or the death of a child. And I'm sure, you know, that's something common to other faiths too. Over the months then after the funeral itself, there'll be more pastoral contact, there'll be more rituals which are possible in different Christian traditions. General follow-up pastoral care. If there's been a cremation, then the ashes will either need to be scattered or buried, or they could be kept in a person's house. If there's been a burial, then the headstone might be blessed. There may be memorial services, especially in some traditions around the Feast of All Souls, when Christians remember the dead in November. That's a couple of days after what's become secular Halloween, but actually All Saints, All Souls is when we remember the dead. And often people will pray anyway for the deceased on anniversaries of their death, or give donations to a church or to charity in memory of a person who's died.
That's great. Thanks, Rowena. That's very comprehensive. I'll check in. Hardeep's still trying to connect on her phone, so I'll move on to Charu. Can you say something from the Hindu perspective around the actual episode of death, if you like?
Yep. Okay. So the preference for the dead person, for the preference for the person dying to be brought to their house is really voiced quite a lot. Once the person has died, then as soon as possible, we try to bring that body close to Mother Earth, often placing the body on the floor if that's permitted. If the death is in hospital, then some rituals take place there, as I said above, followed by the family arranging to visit to the funeral directors and the body there to see that all the right clothing is put on the body. Once the body has been washed, it is preferred for members of the same sex to wash the body of the deceased. Of all this time, prayers are chanted and recited, and they are specific to what the particular family wishes to do. The coffin is brought to the home so that they can the body can depart from the home, so a final farewell can take place in the home. At the home, family members are encouraged to come and visit, as are some close friends. When the body is brought into the house, the head comes into the home first, and the body, when it leaves, the feet are expected to leave first. Funeral directors who attend often know exactly what the Hindu family want because it's been discussed. Within the Hindu faith, there are 16 sacraments, or we call them samskaras. The last one, the Antyeshti, is the cremation ritual, and this is the final sacrament. This ritual is performed after the death of the person so that the soul can depart and rest in peace. If there is a son of the deceased, he performs this Vedic ritual at the cremation site or at the home in the UK. All 5 elements are used, which is talked about in the prayers: earth, water, fire, air, and ether, and these are dispersed into nature. Hindus are mostly, all of them mostly are cremated. If it is a young child, because the child hasn't developed an attachment to the body, then that's the only time when that body is buried. If death is of a person who has had a fulfilled and relatively long life, then much acceptance of the fact and resignation to the idea that they have had their time on this earth and it was their time to depart this particular shell that they occupy, the body. The body is seen as the shell that they occupy, and that they are now ready to move on to the next life. After the funeral, people have attended the funeral, they all go home to take a quick bath, and then they attend for a simple meal, and then friends who have come from afar will leave. On the 12th day for men and on the 13th day for women, usually, there is a get-together where the food that the departed one enjoyed, there is a meal made with those kind of foods and shared. And then there are various ritual obligations that take place towards the forefathers, teachers, and the wise and learned folk known to the deceased. The bereaved family have encouraged, before the person has died, for the person to give recognition to any of their bad karma, bad deeds that they have done in life. So before the departed soul, usually that person has done what they need to do about that, so that their soul can leave this earth feeling that it can rest in peace.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Charu. We'll come to Hardeep. Hardeep, if we can come to you at the end, if that's all right. So I'm going to move on and ask Marion from a Baha'i perspective. Marion?
Oh. So, when the soul disassociates itself from the body, the funeral arrangements are made by the family and anybody else they choose to involve. It probably would also be the local spiritual assembly of that town. Baha'is are not embalmed, but they are buried and not cremated. The body is washed and then wrapped in a shroud and placed in a coffin, and a Baha'i ring is placed on the finger. The Baha'i ring bears the inscription, "I came forth from God and return unto him, detached from all save him, holding fast to his name, the merciful, the compassionate." This is written in Arabic script around the edges of the ring, so it fits very nice. It's not a big ring, but it looks very dignified, and that's the only thing that is different in a Baha'i burial in that respect. And I would say that because there are no sects or divisions in the Baha'i faith, this is universal. I've been to Baha'i burials in West Africa, and it is just the same. The place of burial, and this is one of our laws, must not be more than 1 hour's distance from the place of death. So then the body is interred with great serenity, dignity, with radiance and respect. And as there are no priests in our faith, the family will prepare and choose the order of service, the prayers, the readings, the eulogy, whatever they would like. And they would ask friends, family to read. So every burial service is unique. Prayers, as I mentioned before, could be read, chanted or sung. And the service can be attended by men, women, children of any race, religion or background. There is only one formality in our religion in that respect, which is the prayer for the dead, when the prayer is said as a congregational prayer. It was revealed by Baha'u'llah to be said by the coffin before the coffin is interred. So whilst this is a very sad occasion and very dignified, we also remember the life that the person has led and what they've achieved in life. And this is to be celebrated and respected. So always support and comfort for the person who's been bereaved, for the family and the community, but we don't have any particular rituals. But the support from the family is paramount.
Okay, lovely. Thanks, Marion. Thank you. And Afrasia, over to you. Unmute.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so just with regards to, obviously, when somebody passes away, one of the first things that we have as a requirement is that there's a duty for the family and for loved ones to ensure that the deceased is buried as soon as is possible. So one of the things that then you will find is that you'll come across is that there's a reluctance, you know, for looking at cause of death and postmortems and things like that. So, you know, that is something that will try to be avoided, just so that the burial can take place as soon as possible. And within that, the deceased will have certain rights as well. So the first one of those is the ghusl, which is the ritual washing of the body. Again, similar to other faiths that we've just heard, and that will be done usually by members of the family, but it will be of the same sex as the person that's passed away. And then there's the coffin, which is the shrouding, which is a piece of white cloth will be used to show modesty, and all deceased will be wrapped in the coffin as part of the shrouding process. And then you've got the third rite as part of that is obviously the janazah, which is the funeral, which will take place. And as part of that, there'll be a special funeral prayer that will be read, and there will be an opportunity for family members prior to that and after the prayer to view for a viewing of the person that's passed away as well. And then obviously the final part of that, the rites will be the actual burial of the deceased, and that will be done in a way where they are facing towards, so their face will be facing towards Mecca when they pass away as part of that. There's usually it's different in different, again, like other religions, there are different branches, different denominations, but traditionally there is a 3-day mourning process as part of that. And as Muslims, we will go and visit and offer our condolences. Often here in this country, the gatherings will take place in the mosques or large community centres where people will go and visit the family to offer support. And usually the prayer that's read is the Fatiha, which is the opening prayer of the Holy Quran, which Muslims will recite to pray for the deceased.
Great, thanks, Afrasiab. Amy, from a Jewish point of view. Unmute, yes, good.
Am I unmuted?
Yeah.
Okay, so traditionally in Judaism, we also try to bury the bodies within 24 hours. So big rush to get there. You can hold the funeral at a synagogue or in a cemetery or a funeral home. It will be similar to other people. We'll have Jewish texts. We have a special mourner's prayer, eulogy. And the eulogy tends to be, you know, you talk about the values the person lived by. You talk about the good deeds that they performed. And I love all the similarities, but everyone is buried in a simple shroud. So there is no distinguishing between rich and poor. Your body will be cleansed, washed, and dressed in the shroud, but it will actually be, it's a Jewish burial society that are usually volunteers that do this, and they also have to stay with the body overnight until the funeral. The caskets have to be wood, not lined with metal. Essentially, you're going from dust to dust, so you don't want to interfere with the disintegration of the body. So there's no embalming either. We're basically just going back to the earth the way that we were created from it. We will often put soil from Israel, from Jerusalem, in the coffin. Flowers are actually considered non-Jewish ritual customs, so we don't tend to have flowers. We don't send flowers. The thing that we do is to honor the person by making a contribution to a charity, a synagogue, or a hospital. And probably one of the more unusual rituals is that the immediate family will rip their garment either before the funeral or at the funeral. In modern days, sometimes there's a ceremonial ribbon that's cut, but that's based on stories from the Bible, just part of our traditions. And everybody actually fills in the earth in the immediate family, so everybody has takes a part in shoveling the earth into the hole, basically. And if a friend is asked, it's considered an honor. I am longer on this one, by the way. Then we have a 7-day period of mourning. You don't go to work. This is the hard bit in COVID. This is when the community, it's really their obligation to go to the person's house and say a prayer every night. And this, I think, has been the hardest part about COVID, is not being able to have that 7-day period. That's the whole point of how we help people through. And during the 7-day period called Shiva, it's called sitting Shiva, men will refrain from shaving, women won't wear makeup, you know, you're just focusing on, there's a lot of different parts of this. And I guess to just make it faster, there are other rituals, but at the end, we will have an unveiling of the tombstone, usually just a year before the anniversary is over. And every year we light a special 24-hour candle and say prayers. I mean, there's so much, but that's kind of the gist of it. Thanks.
That's really rich in terms of the follow-up, the follow-on, and the recognition over a period of a year after the death. Yeah, that's quite powerful. Thanks, Amy. Neil, from a Buddhist.
Well, from my Buddhism, and again, they vary massively from group to group. We tend to follow the culture of the country. In this country, my experience with funerals tend to be similar to a celebrant funeral. We have basically one ritual that fits everything. It's a very simplistic ritual where we recite 2 aspects of the Lotus Sutra. It takes about 4 minutes, and then we chant what's called Daimoku, which is a phrase we repeat over and over again, and we end with some silent prayers. And the funeral procedure will consist of that little service. Then we'll have a eulogy. Somebody will get up and speak very kindly about that person. But it's seen very much as, obviously there's a grieving process, we're human beings, but we try to focus on the celebrating that person's life. So there's mourning, but it's more of a cheerful mourning, if you will. We have a little bit of a thing, don't know where it comes from, don't know what it means, but we have 47 days. We chant for that person, we remember that person in our chanting for around about 47 days where possible. And then thereafter. But we also, when somebody dies who's a member of the organisation, we have an administrative centre in Taplow, just outside Maidenhead. And there's a big Gahonzan, which is a scroll we chant to. And their name goes up in front of that, because there's always people chanting in there. And that's it from me.
But again, some recurring themes there around the honouring or valuing the person, as well as cultural components and the making sense of things. Right, Hardeep, are you with us on the phone? Can you unmute? And I can unmute you. Hardeep, okay.
All right.
Oh,
can you hear me?
Better. That's much better. Yes.
All right. I'm sorry about that. My system is totally.
We'll get you sorted.
I won't use any other language. Okay. So when the inevitable comes, death is upon us. At that time, it's sad for everyone and all the family members. Loved ones and the wider community get together, and we recite the word Vaheguru, which means God is great. And everybody recites that, and we should try not to cry or weep. It is believed that if we do that, that causes obstacles for the departed soul. Rather, we should, it is believed that we should induce mood of resignation to God's will by reciting Vaheguru. So the practical way of looking after the body is bathed and clothed in clean clothes. Prayer is offered to take away the body for cremation. And again, prayer for consigning the body to fire is given. As soon as the death occurs, reading of the holy book, Guru Granth Sahib, starts and finish, followed by special prayers and singing of detachment-inducing hymns prior to the final prayer. After that, there is a communal meal is served and shared by all, followed by the full service. The whole bulk of ashes after that, including bones, are collected and immersed in flowing waters or buried deep, and no headstones on monuments erected. And there are special prayers for this time as well, which is Kirtan Soila, which is last rites, basically, and Alahania, again, is sad composition in the Guru Granth Sahib, which is recited at that time. That's it, basically, about that. Thank you.
Thanks for being so concise, Hardeep, and good to hear you nice and clear. I'm just going to mute you again now. So I don't know if there's any, I mean, what I was struck by there was the common aspects of valuing the person and recognizing the value of their life. I think Rowena articulated the second point most, but I wonder what other traditions about the making sense of life and death. And then perhaps the most practical thing around the cultural, the actual ritual. And I'm intrigued, and this is again a conversation for somewhere else, where the boundary, you know, the crossover between religious ritual and cultural practice. You know, I think of roadside shrines and flowers and messages attached to railings and where people have died in road accidents. And it seems to me there is a real need for people to express something around death. And it's, as we've just heard, there's a huge range of the rituals and the chants and the practices around that. But I'm intrigued at, and I suppose this is where, you know, religious people of real faith and, if we like, secular society, it seems to me there's still a depth there, even within secular non-belief, the clinging on or exploring something around death and the mystery of death, I suppose. So thanks for sort of opening some of that up for further conversations later. I'm not seeing any other questions on chat at this point, so I'm actually going to move us on because it's taken a little bit longer than I'd thought, and Neil has to go at 4. So I'm just going to move on to our last section, and then perhaps if people are still able to hang on after that for any questions or discussion. I'm just going to rejig the order a little bit and ask Neil to go first on, from each of our perspectives, thoughts, ideas, beliefs around life after death, eternal life, call it what we will. So Neil, over to you.
I think this is where we're going to differ quite significantly, because we're an atheistic practice. Some Buddhist groups see the Buddha as a god. Some we don't. We believe in the Buddha in ourselves. So we've no Godhead figure. We believe we believe in the eternity of life. So Buddhism was born of Hinduism, I think, and Hindus believe in reincarnations, and I think that, forgive my ignorance, but I think that denotes a journey up until a final destination. As we believe, a good analogy to use is the analogy of a wave breaking on the shore. Our life is the universe, part of the universe. Universe is a sea, and our life is a wave that breaches on the shore and recedes back into the sea, and that's how we see it. Now, we also have a concept of profound karmic bonds or profound spiritual connections, where people who we feel a real connection to in this life, we will connect with them again. I'll never be Neil Proctor, my wife will never be my wife, but that profound bond will bond us together through eternity. And one which is quite different from a lot of faiths. We believe that you choose. We don't consciously go, I wouldn't want to go off to Africa, but we believe that the obstacles or the karma that we face in this lifetime, we want that as an opportunity to overcome the struggles in this life in preparation for the next one. But that doesn't mean to say the next life's going to be easier, because our life is seen as a continual struggle, but not in a negative sense. It's just continual struggle of betterment. So we invite the obstacles into our life. So yeah, that's where we're at with our Buddhism. Thank you for listening.
Okay, I know you've got to go to another meeting. Thanks for your input, Neil. Marion, could I come to you next from a Baha'i perspective on whatever you want to call it, afterlife, life after death, eternity? Thanks,
yes,
Marion.
of course, thank you. So as I mentioned before, Baha'is see the very purpose of this life as a preparation of the soul for the eternal and many realms of God. Its progress is infinite. We pray then for the departed soul, as we believe they can pray for us from the next world. We also believe, and it's written clearly, that those in the life beyond do not forget this life on earth. And in fact, there is no real distinction between the two. So we can pray for them and they pray for us. If we choose to, we can offer services or a gift to a deserving cause, or as a mark of remembrance, or as affection, or donate to the Baha'i Fund in that person's name as a mark of respect. It isn't seen as a payment in that respect, it's just seen as a mark of remembrance. And we also believe that in the next life, Baha'u'llah writes that souls in the next world associate and communicate with each other. But that is a spiritual communion. Many people will ask Baha'is, well, what do you believe about heaven and hell? And it is something common to most religions, obviously, but we don't regard that as places of existence. We believe that heaven and hell are conditions within our own beings, and that our soul will still continue through the many worlds of God, because man is destined to develop spiritually throughout eternity. So hell then, perhaps for me, and I'm giving this all from my personal point of view because there are no clergy, hell would be perhaps to be removed from God, and that would be a concept I would feel. So thank you for listening, everyone.
Oh, thank you, Marion. And there's a lot there that I could, as a Christian, that I can definitely associate with, of heaven and hell not being places, but being conditions. Yeah. Afrasiab, can I ask you from a Muslim perspective? I've lost you. Oh, there you are. Okay. Afrasiab, off you go.
I think the first thing to say on this, from my point of view, would be that when somebody passes away, one of the first thing that we see on hearing that someone's passed away are words "Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un," which it broadly translates as that from Allah we come and to Allah it is that we return, which sort of tells us that, you know, that our life in this world is temporary, and as Muslims we also believe in the life after death, and that this life is a preparation for our afterlife. And similar to other religions, there is a concept of Jannah and Jahannam, which is heaven and hell. That is something that is you know, something that we believe in, but without going into that. But I think just to give it some, in terms of that you know, that preparation, and that time here is temporary, and that death is a part of this cycle, is again, there's a narration of the in hadith of the Prophet Moses, and the angel of death comes to the Prophet Moses, and when the Prophet Moses sees him, he slaps him in the eye, and the angel of death goes back to God and says that Moses is not he's not ready to die. So God says to the angel of death, go back to him and ask him to place his hand on an ox, and the number of hairs that will be beneath his hand, I will increase his life by that many years. So the angel of death goes back and asks him to do that, and then so the Prophet Moses does that, and then says, and then what? And the angel of death says, and then you will die. And so Moses responds with, well, okay, well, if that's what's going to happen after all of that, then I will go now. And so it just tells us about that life is temporary on this earth, and that you know, it is a part of the whole cycle.
Thanks, Afrasiab. Afrasiab, just to note, there's a question from Rebecca on the chat. So if you might have a look at that, and again, anybody who wants to input to the chat, just so to break up your concentrating on the screen and what we're listening to, this might help with your concentration. So just have a read of the chat and put some any thoughts in there. So we'll move on to Amy, and this is the one you're going to be quite quick on, Amy, I think.
Okay, yeah, pretty quick. This is a really short section for Judaism. We don't have an official dogma regarding what happens to the soul, other than the fact that it's immortal. In the Bible, it barely spends any time discussing what happens when we die, and that's really because Judaism just focuses on your current life. So in the scriptures, there are references to afterlife. It's from, refers to things like a place of darkness under the earth, a resurrected life for the soul, and also in some traditions, actually reincarnation as well. There is no place for eternal torture. There's just a place for the dead, whether you're good or bad. And to be honest, Jews really don't concern themselves with it at all. It's just kind of one of those things it just doesn't come up. I think the main thing is when someone dies, there's a concept of resignation. Death is beyond man's control, and the pursuit of life is not. So we just go on, and that's pretty much it.
Very practical, very down to earth. Good stuff. And chicken soup as well.
Keep you alive a bit longer.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. That again, fascinating. Where over history practice has changed and belief has developed and changed. There's another really interesting one to pursue further, I think. Hardeep, are you with us? Hardeep. I'm unmuting you now, Hardeep. Yep.
Are you ready?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Right. Sikhs believe that upon death, one merges back into the universal nature, just as a drop of rain merges back into the sea or ocean. Individuality is lost, body becomes dust, spirit shifts into another body or merges with God. Sikhs do not believe in heaven or hell. Heaven can be experienced by being in tune with God whilst living and by doing the good deeds such as truthful living, compassion, patience, contentment, humility, love, wisdom, courage, and self-control. Hell can be avoided by staying away from the 5 evils, which are lust, anger, greed, attachment, and ego. By adopting the virtues in life, which are the good things, one can merge with the spirit of the Creator and gets rid of the cycle of birth and death. In other words, that spirit doesn't come back in life. If we cannot get rid of the 5 evils, one does not get salvation and get back into the cycle of birth, life, and death again. After everything finishes, it is after the 12 months, there is another ceremony, which is just to remember the person and do a service, a big service in the temple, in the Gurdwara, and just to reflect back on the life of the person and that is the end of it, really. Life. Yeah.
So, Hardeep, you say that reminds me of what Amy was saying, that after 12 months, there's some sort of ceremony or remembrance event. Is that true then in Sikhism? That after 12?
Yes. We do. We actually do it after 11 months. I don't understand why 11 months, but it is 11 to 12 months. We do either the full reading of the book at the Gurdwara, or people can do it at home and then have full service in the Gurdwara with the fellow members, community people, and everybody. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. Thanks, Hardeep. 2 to go. Thanks for waiting patiently. Rowena, can you say something? Can you cover all of this?
I don't think I can cover all of it, but I'll just skim across the surface. So eternal life and the belief in the resurrection are absolutely fundamental to Christianity. We do have the language of heaven and hell, that's biblical language, but it can be quite challenging language because it can suggest that we know who's going to which place, or indeed that they are geographical locations, and that's not really particularly helpful. So Christians have other language for talking about the afterlife as well. We often talk about the kingdom of God, and we often use the word salvation, which actually literally just means being healthy. But we understand that as meaning being at one with God. That's much more nuanced and inclusive, and I think a much more helpful way of understanding what Christians believe about life after death, that it is salvation, it's being healthy at one, perfect with God. And in that, the afterlife is something which is both individual, so there's a sense in which me as Rowena, I remain a Rowena after I'm dead, but I also then belong to part of a bigger and perfect community where there is no violence, no war, no competition. So that kind of communal afterlife is really important. So death for Christians is not the end of our human existence. In a sense, it's when we most fully become ourselves. We are our most human after death in the afterlife. But of course, people still grieve in this life because they're grieving for the person that they've known and lost. And we don't think that people shouldn't be sad just because we believe in the resurrection. Also for Christians, the body is very important. Whether people are buried or cremated, actually the body during this life is important. Christians believe that Jesus is God in bodily form. A lot of our worship involves food, and so when we talk about the soul or things kind of spiritual, even though the soul itself does not have a physical body, the soul for Christians is always somehow attached to some form of a body, even if the body after life doesn't look like the body looks now. There is one other, just very quickly, one other aspect of Christian thought about death, and that's whether you should pray for people who've died. That's quite controversial depending on the Christian tradition. So there are some traditions that very much would pray for people who've died, and other traditions that would say, no, you shouldn't pray for people who've died because what's happened has happened and you're not going to change it. For me, as a member of the Church of England, as a Christian, I would be very comfortable praying for people who have died on the basis that Christians believe that God is actually outside human time. And that when we pray, which is in a sense when we talk and listen to God, it's never about giving God a shopping list to say this is what we want to happen, or help this person who's died. It's about understanding the will of God. So I'm very comfortable praying for people who've died in that sense, but not all Christians are.
Thanks, Rowena. That's fantastic to cover all that. Yeah. As with the other faiths, and again, this will be really interesting to develop some of this further, the spread of belief within each of our faiths, our different denominations. Many of my good friends are Catholic, and so saying masses for the dead and praying to the saints and would be something they'd be comfortable with, whereas some of my more evangelical Christian friends would definitely not be quite so comfortable with that. So yeah, plenty of food for thought. Last but not least, Charu, from a Hindu perspective, please.
Thank you, Peter. From a Hindu perspective, basically, it's important that, if I said at the very beginning that we're talking about the Brahman, which is basically the creation theory, and the fact that we have energy forces, which is creation, preservation, and destruction. They're all energy forces, and that once we have left this body, our soul goes there, but it only goes there once you have been born and died and reborn and died and reborn and died many, many, many times. And that you only get that release from being born again if you have done lots of good deeds and have attained spiritual realization about that which is good, and good can be defined in lots of ways. And so the soul does not have to be reborn in somebody's body to live and to exist on this earth. And the belief within the Hindus is that if there is any hell, then that hell is on earth, and it is basically because you have not worked and aspired towards this realization of perfection, which allows you to get release from this body, this mortal body. And when you look at Hindu ideas and philosophy, there are 4 facts of Hinduism. And they are karma, which is your actions and your deeds. There is dharma, which is the law of living, fulfilling nature and one's life journey, which is destiny. And then there is rebirth, which I have explained. And then there is worship through acts of different forms of worship, which could even be being a good whatever, a good Bobby, a good fireman, a good whatever, good mother, good father, good brother, those sorts of things. Hindus also believe that Hindu gods come to earth as they are needed. And what is most fascinating is that we believe that in every human being and everything around the world, God exists. So we see God in everybody and everywhere. It isn't that you have to go to a particular place to see God. God exists everywhere, and it is for us to see God in people's actions, behaviors, deeds, whatever else. And just before I finish off, just to say that what a lot of people have said about the need for people to go and give their respect and share condolences is very important. To turn up at the funeral service to show moral support is really seen as important. And like we found out from the Jewish, from Amy, that this is what people have missed when people have died of COVID or in this time where you can't go to visit. Usually for at least the first 7 days, we would go to somebody's house and share their loss and grieve with them, so that they would gradually become accustomed to the notion that this has actually happened. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to share this.
Okay, well, that's been fantastic. Thank you, everybody, for so succinctly covering such a lot. There's probably at least another 2 webinars that we could construct there. Just be having a think if there's any questions you want to pose. But while you're doing that, I'm actually going to ask Alison, who's from the from Lancashire Teaching Hospitals, Preston and Chorley, who's joined us today, and maybe that mention there of what's been happening through COVID. Alison, you've had a very direct engagement with that. So do you want to unmute yourself and just say a few words?
Hi, everybody. One of the reasons I joined you today, I'm doing a lot of work around the chaplaincy areas that we have in the hospital. When COVID came along, we were very mindful of the fact that patients couldn't see their family. No visitors were allowed in. And we're also very mindful of the fact that sometimes people want their own chaplaincy people to come in. And we've sort of now put in place like a multi-faith chaplaincy that covers all the faiths that we could put together. brought them in, give them training, COVID awareness, fit them with masks, so that if we need to, and these people kindly agreed that they could come in, and we had to be ensured of their safety and their families and the patients, but have these people come in and visit our patients, be it just for prayers or be it for end of life. So during this time, we've had a few things brought to mind about ward staff and what to do sometimes in the case when somebody passes over, and there is certain beliefs, and at the point of death sometimes people have different customs, and we've got this wrong in the past. So I'm currently putting together and updating like a document that we have that covers all the different faiths, but also there's a little passage in there to explain to ward staff, this is what you need to do when this person dies, this is the procedure, this is what their beliefs are, and so we try and get everything right. So I'm just currently putting this book together. So this has been really interesting because some of the stuff that has come out, especially the dying, you know, the process around that for everybody. But if possible, I'd like to join you again. I've wrote about 3 pages of notes, but I'd like to join you again so that I can get more information.
Yes, great. Thanks, Alison. I mean, as all the people who've presented here, we meet regularly as the Lancashire Forum of Faiths. So yeah, we'll invite you to our next meeting,
Thank you.
and we could just have you as the main item, and you can just interrogate. You can just interrogate everybody.
Yeah.
But thanks ever so much for joining and for bringing that real practical element. You know, that experience of what it's been like on the front line through COVID, but perhaps again thinking of that idea that out of grief and suffering good things can come. You know, it may be that having that guidance for what to do in the circumstances of deaths from different faiths, that if we hadn't had this crisis, it might not have stimulated that getting that together. So
we've had so many good things done. I mean, the Muslim community, they donated loads of Quran cubes. For the patients to have, and we had that many. We were able to share them with Blackburn hospitals and Morecambe and things like that. So it's been a real good community feel at the hospital with everyone's different involvement.
Yeah, good. Any questions from the audience? Again, I realise that was quite intense there. We've covered a lot, and if you've got any thoughts or suggestions for, this was a pilot to some extent, but I'm sure I feel from my point of view it's worked pretty well. It may be, it's laid the foundations for doing something similar in the future on other topics. I mean, again, at the Resilience Forum, we've talked about recently issues around the opening of places of worship. So it might be that to explore, well, what does constitute worship in different faiths? So there's probably lots of things we could talk about. So thanks all for attending. Is there any burning questions or things anybody would like to say, or just a comment anybody would like to make? You can unmute yourself, and as long as you're not too long. Andy Pratt.
Just to say, I've found it incredibly informative, even though I've been working around faith issues and different faiths for many, many years. I've still learnt loads of things I didn't know. It's hard to write everything in a book, and it's great to hear people speak and speak from the heart. And we don't talk about death enough. And I think Rowena made a point, and others, that this current time has allowed a lot more discussion around death. I mean, as a Christian, I'd like to hear more and more discussion in our church about death and how we support and think about death. And because it's coming to us all. So yeah, thank you to everybody. I found it really quite emotional listening to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah. Rebecca, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to say this has been really useful for me, and I think it would be really great if there was a way for myself and my team to talk more about life after death, particularly with Afro-Siab or someone from the Muslim community, because we work with refugees and death kind of pervades every aspect of their life. Like, that's what they've come from, that's what they've run away from, their family's still out there dying, and there's so much we don't know. I mean, there's only one person in our team who is Muslim, so it would be great to learn about how to support them through that and what is sensitive and what is right. So if there's any way we could do that, that would be really helpful, I think, for us and for the refugees.
Yeah.
If I can just come in on that, Peter, I think
Please.
from a, yeah, obviously from a faith perspective, but also then from an LCC perspective, I think, Rebecca, I think we just need to touch base then, don't we, so we can provide that support.
Yeah.
And then just going off the issue that you raised earlier, Peter, around the cultural versus religious, and that links in a bit to what Rebecca's saying. I think because here in Britain, the vast majority of Muslims that practice the Islamic faith will be from the Indian subcontinent, from Asian heritage, and so sometimes there's a confusion between, sometimes we're not quite sure what is cultural and what is religious, and the two can overlap, and especially when we're talking about asylum seekers and the refugees, and they're coming and they will be of the Islamic faith, but their viewpoint or where they're coming from and the traditions that they follow might be slightly different. So it's about us as then as Muslims making sure that we can cater for all communities as part of that as well. So different things come into that. But yeah, Rebecca, I'll catch up with you and we'll definitely have a chat around that. Okay.
Yeah. And just to, okay, and just to sort of close then, I think that point you make there, Afrasiab, about understanding each other's, or understanding the cultures, the practices of others, is such an important part of, you know, community building. I think my sort of mantra, as some of you will have heard in interfaith work, is that, you know, to increase our level of understanding and build relationships, and those two things very much go together. So one of the purposes, or one of the intentions with doing this today and recording it, is that things like this can actually be a useful resource. It's been recorded, so we can actually make use of this in schools, for example, community settings, wherever this sort of discussion or this information would be useful. And the third and final point, I think, is that, again, silver linings. I hadn't used Zoom until, you know, 3 months ago, and now we've got together a panel, and it would have taken weeks, if not months, to try and find a date when we could all have met in a live physical setting. We're actually able to do that online. So there's huge potential for learning and relationship building through this virtual medium. So thanks very much, everybody. I think we'll do some follow up. We'll have a bit of a chat about this through the Lancashire Forum of Faiths. But if you've got any further thoughts or ideas, you know, do get in touch with me, and look forward to seeing some or all of you again in the near future. Thanks very much. Do you want to just stay on the line, Rebecca, and have a quick chat?